everybody, and good evening. My name is Erin Tobin, and I am the Executive Director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, also known as ARCH. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you to John Brown Lives for partnering with us on this program, and to Humanities New York for funding tonight's webinar through an action grant. We have an incredibly esteemed group of panelists with us today, who I will introduce shortly. The North Country has a long history as a place of institutionalization. Our program this evening focuses on currently vacant Adirondack prisons that feature historic buildings and those communities that emerged in and around those institutions. Some North Country prisons are repurposed and reutilized historic buildings that began as medical institutions, housing tuberculosis patients or people with mental illness, or even a school, while others began their life as carceral structures. The communities formed to support these institutions relied on them for jobs and economic well-being, while the individuals living within the institutions frequently experienced trauma. Here you see in clockwise order, starting at the top left, Mount McGregor in Saratoga County, Lion Mountain in Clinton County, Camp Gabriel's in Franklin County, and Ogdensburg Correctional in St. Lawrence County. All historic buildings with prior institutional uses, and all which are currently vacant. This December, New York State released a report focused on the physical characteristics of the vacant prisons throughout the state and needs of the surrounding communities, describing real estate trends and redevelopment assets. But the history of these spaces and the government policies that created them is crucial to repairing the economic health and social well-being of all affected by our region's heavy investment in mass incarceration. Any discussion of building reuse should honor the individuals who lived in the prisons as part of the broader Adirondack community, respecting the trauma that may have taken place in those spaces, along with the host community's deep involvement in the prison institutions for economic stability. And these spaces often reflect the lives, experiences, and dreams of the individuals incarcerated there by the state. ARCH this summer led tours of Camp Gabriel's in Franklin County, owned by New York State and currently proposed for a constitutional amendment to remove the site from the forest preserve. The murals you see here on the walls of the gym at Camp Gabriel's were painted by men who were incarcerated there. Those responsible for these sites must bring all voices together as part of the conversation about how these buildings, which have often evolved multiple times, can be part of that larger community restoration, repair, and reclamation. I'd now like to introduce Martha Swan, Executive Director of John Brown Lives, to welcome everyone as well. After that, you will hear from our panelists in this order: Dr. Clarence Jefferson Hall Jr., author and assistant professor of history at the City University of New York, Queensborough; Ara Newman, a former Camp Gabriel's employee and resident of Franklin County; Dr. Alice Green, Executive Director and founder of the Center for Law and Justice in Albany; Terrell Mohammed, Senior Advocate at the Alliance of Families for Justice; and Erin Mayer, Adirondack Wilderness Campaign Director at the Adirondack Council. My colleague, ARCH Educational Programs Director Nolan Kuhl, was a part of our project and is here helping to moderate this evening's webinar, making sure things run smoothly. And Nolan, Martha, and Jeff Hall all joined me as the steering committee in preparation for this evening's webinar event. And with that, Martha, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Erin and Nolan and Jeff. I was very grateful that Erin reached out a year or so ago to participate in sort of putting together this really important conversation. I think one of many to come, that have happened, but many more to come from the information and critique and suggestions perhaps offered with this convening tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar, John Brown Lives is a freedom, education, and human rights project based here in the Adirondacks. And we are also the official Friends group, New York State Friends group of the John Brown Farm. So with that, I'm back to you, Erin. And thank you all to the panelists.
Thank you, Martha. So I will introduce each panelist right before they speak. And our first speaker this evening is Jeff Hall, Dr. Clarence Jefferson Hall Jr., who is known by his lifelong nickname, Jeff. Grew up in the wilds of northern New York State, hiking, camping, skiing, and cycling, which fueled a love of the outdoors. And he also developed a love of history that he really invested in making that his career, completing his undergraduate and master's studies at the State University of New York at Binghamton, which is also my alma mater, and received his PhD in history from SUNY Stony Brook. Jeff is now assistant professor of history at CUNY, the City University of New York, Queensborough, and an author. Jeff presented his book, A Prison in the Woods, at an Arch Author Talk webinar last spring. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Erin. I'm going to use some slides, so just be a second here. All right. Are my slides visible to everybody? We're good? Okay, great. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I just want to begin by thanking some folks here. First, Erin, for inviting me to serve on the steering committee for this event and also for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I also want to thank my friends Nolan Kuhl and Erin Newman and Martha Swan for their hard work in helping to bring all of us together for this important conversation. I'm also delighted to be in dialogue once again with my friends, Dr. Alice Green and Terrell Muhammad, and I'm honored to share this virtual stage with Erin Mayer, whose work up to now I have only been able to admire from afar. It's a real privilege to be with each of you. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Professional Staff Congress of CUNY, which is our union, and the Center for Critical Discard Research at Pratt Institute for their ongoing support of my work. The subject of our conversation is a roughly 180-acre parcel of land located on Route 86 in the Franklin County hamlet of Gabriels in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. Shielded from view by thickets of vegetation, including some very tall trees, passers-by may be forgiven for not appreciating this site's historical significance. In all likelihood, peoples of the Mohawk Nation, the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, have utilized the tract for subsistence, shelter, and ceremony. Late in the 19th century, the site hosted temporary housing erected for workers building a railroad through the Adirondacks. In the mid-1890s, the local Roman Catholic diocese purchased the property and constructed a tuberculosis sanitarium that operated until the early 1960s. Just a few years later, nearby Paul Smith's College bought the multi-building complex from the diocese for use as a satellite campus. In the early 1980s, financial troubles and declining enrollment at Paul Smith's neatly coincided with an overcrowding crisis in New York's prison system. While the Corrections Department's May 1981 proposal to purchase the compound in Gabriels and convert it to a minimum security prison met a hostile response from most local residents, the law favored the state in such cases, and the correctional facility opened after significant opposition-induced delays in August of 1982. Driven by a steady decline in New York's prison population, the state closed Gabriel's Correctional Facility in 2009. Plans for redevelopment remain on hold as a constitutional amendment required to transfer the property from public to private ownership has been held up in the state legislature. Meanwhile, the site and its numerous historic buildings are rapidly succumbing to more than a decade of human neglect. And we'll just show some photos here. These are from the tour that Aaron mentioned that I was fortunate enough to participate in back in the summer. Aaron? At the same time, the absence of human activity has proved a boon for the property's plant life, which has been free to expand unimpeded for the first time since the 19th century. And you can see some of that here in this photo. Here, especially here. It's a small forest growing there now. And right here, the photos don't really do this justice. If you visit the site in the summer, it's really incredible the way plant life is taking over this facility. Further, inadequate security measures have allowed graffiti artists and vandals to visit the complex and damage historically significant features of the site. This is a chapel that was part of the facility when it was a tuberculosis sanitarium. This, I assume, is from when the facility was a prison, some kind of holding tank. And this is a more modern structure built by the corrections department when the facility was a prison. I witnessed these unfortunate transformations firsthand during an Arch-sponsored tour led by my friends Aaron, Nolan, and Aaron of the compound in August of last year. While privately sponsored development may be inevitable, there is an urgent need to ensure that the history embedded in Gabriel's built and unbuilt environments be preserved and interpreted for future generations. And I'm just going to show some historic photos here for a moment. These are photos that maybe Era will speak about in a moment. If she doesn't, we can definitely talk later. These are photos that were saved from the trash by Era when the prison was closing. So you see some incarcerated men and an officer there working on a retaining wall at that same chapel back when the prison, shortly after it opened. You see some incarcerated men from Gabriel's in this photo working on facilities at Buck Pond State Campground, which is not far from Gabriel's. And one more. Incarcerated men from Gabriel's working at the Lake Clear sawmill, where wood was cut, and Era may be able to speak more about this later, used for directional signs that were placed across the North Country. Combining sanitarium buildings erected in the early 20th century with more modern and some say unattractive structures built by the corrections department in the latter part of the century, the Gabriel's campus, crisscrossed by roadways and sidewalks, offers visitors the chance to walk among the buildings and learn about topics, especially incarceration, that more often than not are absent from conventional interpretations of North Country history. Making this site publicly accessible is particularly important given the prominence military commemoration has gained in the North Country's historical landscape. While sites associated with the area's long military history are surely worth preserving and interpreting, prioritizing one chapter of local history risks distorting the whole. In addition to stories from the past that might make us feel good, we must also, in the words of the Hawaiian indigenous activist Kalamakaina Niheu, illuminate the dark spaces of Adirondack history, including mass incarceration, in order to ensure a brighter future for generations yet unborn. Much like the battlefields, fortifications, and obscure historic sites that collectively help tell the North Country's military story, tuberculosis curing, and mass incarceration were place-based endeavors. I applaud the wonderful folks at historic Saranac Lake for the strides they have made in bringing increased visibility to the area's long and storied history as a place of healing and public health research. While the site in Gabriel's surely represents an important chapter in that larger history, it is also part of the Adirondack's older and more extensive history as a site of incarceration. However, unlike the histories of military prowess and TB curing that have been the subject of voluminous scholarly inquiry, critical interpretation of the history of incarceration in the Adirondacks has been a more recent and relatively limited phenomenon. The history is being written now, and the North Country needs a place like Gabriel's that can help tell that critically important place-based story to a wide audience. Finally, preserving and interpreting the former prison at Gabriel's is of critical importance because of New York's shameful history of destroying places associated with the poor and people of color. I'm thinking now of Seneca Village, a community of more than 1,600 free African Americans and impoverished Irish and German immigrants in Manhattan that was leveled to make way for Central Park back in 1857. I'm also thinking about Empire State Plaza in Albany, an urban renewal project that forcibly displaced thousands of former lower income residents and businesses in the 1960s and early 1970s. During the nearly 3 decades when Gabriel's served as a site of incarceration, more than 3/4 of New York's prison population was drawn from impoverished communities of color. At a time when elected officials in other states are attempting to restrict what students can learn about historically marginalized communities in the name of justice and morality, we cannot allow the further destruction of Gabriel's, a place that has much to teach us about the history of Black and Brown New Yorkers. If privately funded adaptive reuse is indeed in this site's future, then I hope its new owners and users will do more than erect a plaque like this one, which is at the Vic in Paul Smith's, which commemorates the fact that incarcerated men built the trail system there, and which is tiny and barely visible. Build a website or issue a boilerplate statement of values. If the Saranac Laboratory and the fortifications at Crown Point are worthy of preservation and interpretation, then in the name of social and racial and environmental justice, so is Gabriel's. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate that. And now, continuing on the theme of Camp Gabriel's in particular, I'd like to introduce Ara Newman. Ara was born and raised in the Catskills and came to the Adirondacks in the early 1990s, where she began her career as working for a veterinarian and then at a local hardware store, getting to know the North Country community very well. And then in 1998, after securing a seasonal job at the Adirondack Fish Hatchery, she moved on to Camp Gabriel's as fiscal staff, where she would be employed for 10 more years until it closed in 2008. And I think it's safe to say that Ara was one of the last people there when Camp Gabriel's closed. Since then, Ara has worked at Paul Smith's College, returned to state service at Sunmount, the OPWDD Center in Tupper Lake, and then since 2016 has worked with Franklin County Community Services, where she is employed today. And throughout her career, Ara has always sought to help all beings in any way possible. Fiscal jobs were her core employment, but the goals were always to do better and be better. And these jobs have enriched her life in connecting with all kinds of diversity in the North Country, from working with preschool age children, adult male inmates, individuals with developmental disabilities, substance abuse, and mental health illnesses. What she learned is that all these moving parts are all tied together and they must collectively be addressed together to make progress, which I think is a line that is a very important theme for tonight's discussion. And Ara will continue to work and serve her community, even into retirement and beyond. And we are at ARCH are very grateful to have gotten to know Ara. So welcome, Ara, and it's up to you.
Thank you, Erin. I know that was a long-winded bio, but yeah, so I'll carry on from here. I worked at Camp Gabriel's at the correctional facility as a commissary clerk starting in '99. At that time, Camp Gabriel's was at its peak population, 363 inmates. My commissary was open Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of each week. Inmates were allowed to shop every 2 weeks. So I'd see about 60 each day. Camp Gabriel's was a work camp with many employment opportunities. Every individual there was assigned a job, whether it was cleaning offices, lawns, grounds, my commissary, a storehouse. My commissary employed two inmates. But each day, green vans idled, some holding about a half dozen inmates and an officer heading out into the community. Highly recognized is their work assisting in the construction of past winter carnival ice palaces, as everyone knows. But less obvious, but well-known are also the creation and maintenance of the Adirondack trails, camps, parks, public sites. Less well-known are their work in cemeteries where headstones were cleaned and enormous rocks may have been moved aside. Snow removal was provided in public spaces. Camp Gabriel's offered asbestos abatement certification for inmates. The sign shop made many of the yellow lettered brown signs in the park. Lean-tos, picnic tables, Adirondack chairs, even dog houses for the local Humane Society were produced there. This is just a thin slice of the list of things the camp provided. If something needed to be done in the community, you could call upon Camp Gabriel's to help. The outdoor work could be hard, hot in the summer, bone-chilling in the winter. Indoor work at times proved to be mundane and suffocating. But this is not a maximum security prison. This is not a typical prison, not like the movies, not like most prisons. There are no fences. Instead, there were chainsaws and tools everywhere. Because of this, there was an extraordinary trust between officers, inmates, civilian staff. Everybody there had a role, and on paper, these roles are distinct and purposeful with hierarchy and order. Inmates are assigned a DIN, D-I-N, a department identification number. Employees are assigned employee numbers, placed in positions that are assigned item numbers. But unseen behind these identification numbers and letters are the other labels. There were deli workers, masons, carpenters, firefighters, doctors, lawyers, drug dealers, drug users, thieves. The labels are endless, and they apply to not only the incarcerated, but officers and civilians as well. But these labels were to be left outside the perimeter. So I grew up in an upscale gated community in Southern New York. In my youth, I'd find myself and my peers committing some of the same crimes that were committed by my customers in that commissary. Wealth and privilege being a large factor deciding which side of the cage we stood. I never considered myself privileged until then. After the first few months at work, I was drafting up a disciplinary ticket against an inmate that swiped a mouse-chewed chocolate bar from the trash outside. The inmate working for me in my commissary subtly reminded me to consider that for this person, eating out of a trash can was their survival skill from where they came. He essentially had me check my privilege. I started to pay closer attention. Inmates released from our business office were under a wide variety of circumstances, such as conditional release, paroling, maxing out. These moments were opportunities for us to experience the vast diversity in our population's backgrounds. Some were released to shelters with the standard $40 state-issued clothing, a white feed bag with their belongings, and a bus ticket back to the county they were convicted in. Others would be clad in lavish outfits shipped to them ahead of their release and picked up just outside the business office entrance by a group of family or friends or a lover. We got a glimpse of who they were outside the jail. I have to remind myself, and I want everyone to know that, and remember too, every incarcerated person was once an infant, a toddler, a child with dreams and a thirst for adventure. The multidimensional circumstances that lead up to incarceration of a person are incredibly complex. In my experience, most incarcerated individuals came from adverse childhoods. Food security, adequate health care, and education are just a few of the critical things that may have improved their odds of success. Many incarcerated knew each other, revealing that whole communities were adversely affected by incarceration. The laws that were meant to protect communities sometimes wiped out large sections of others. Fractured families suffered repeating outcome loops. Staff at Camp Gabriel's were unlike any other place of employment that I've been at. Perhaps the isolation in the woods or the minimalist budget we operated on made us more akin to like a frontier family. Coming in as a young female person of color, I anticipated a plethora of derogatory remarks from both staff and inmates. Though I had a few small confrontations, I must say I was treated well by all. We were a family and always had each other's backs no matter what. We still quibbled like children. I mean, after all, we are family. Perhaps we can contribute our humanity with each other to the ghosts of the camp. Though they were long gone, stories always circulated of a nun appearing at dusk, walking up a hill a foot off the ground. There was a clown that would sit in the commissary, and objects would fly about in the clinic. The campus is one of the most beautiful places of real estate in the park, surrounded by wilderness and a view of Jones Hill from the roadway. The camp had its perks. But with the repeal of the Rockefeller laws, the need for minimum security in camps were no longer. The population dropped from 363, dwindling to just a few dozen as dorms began getting mothballed. Equipment, furniture, and supplies were up for grabs by other correctional facilities. What wasn't claimed was scrapped, discarded, or left behind. So on June 30th, 2009, the last day officially open, we had a barbecue and we all moved on. By the summer of 2009, most of the material had been removed and the camp was basically empty. No employees lost their jobs involuntarily. Many transferred to other prisons, a few retired, and a few took a layoff instead of transferring. But in the end, the goal here with this and our discussion, my hope is that the legacy of the Sisters of Mercy will be carried out with the same dignity and purpose in which they opened it. Camp Gabriel's was and should continue to be a source and symbol of healing. And that is what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ara. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Alice Green. Dr. Green is the executive director of the Center for Law and Justice, a civil rights organization she founded in 1985. She's a doctorate in criminal justice and 3 master's degrees in education, social work, and criminology. The Center for Law and Justice provides community education on civil and criminal justice, legal guidance and advocacy, crisis intervention, and community planning and organizing around criminal justice, civil rights, and civil liberties issues of particular concern to poor communities and those of color. Dr. Green writes and lectures on racism and criminal justice and often does commentary and analysis for a number of newspapers and television and radio programs. In 1997, she founded and is now president of the Payden, am I pronouncing that? Is it Payden?
Yes.
Payden Institute, I should have checked that first, and retreat for writers of color located in the Adirondack town of Essex, New York. There, writers are provided technical assistance and a free environment for writing. In recognition for her work, Dr. Green has received numerous awards from a number of local and state organizations. Dr. Green also grew up in the Adirondacks and is here tonight to share her experiences and perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm just delighted that with this invitation to be part of this illustrious webinar panel to discuss the issue of the redevelopment of closed prisons. I'm particularly pleased to meet some new people as a result and be with several of you that I have worked with over the years. Martha Swan, of course, who has worked for so long as many important social justice issues, including the treatment of families of incarcerated people. Aaron Mayer, I haven't seen you for a while, but Aaron is someone that I've known for a while, and he's already offered a proposal that's worthy of consideration. And I was happy to see that. And Jeff Hall, whose book, Prison in the Woods, spoke volumes about a history that I was unaware of, and his insights into the intersection of the environment, public health, and the tensions around race, class, and belonging in the Adirondack prison towns were quite helpful to me as I looked further at this issue. Furthermore, I'm extremely pleased with Jeff's efforts to recognize and remember those who were incarcerated in those prisons and who contributed so much to the towns and the people in the Adirondacks. Jeff was correct when he noted in his book that most people were unaware of the history of prisons in the Adirondacks before the big buildup of these facilities over the past 4 decades. As was mentioned, I grew up in the Adirondacks and never heard mention of a prison in the area. I didn't know any of them existed. And I guess that's not surprising since there were fewer prisons and they were originally designed to serve a different purpose and a different population. They were primarily meant to house wayward white men who were imprisoned mainly for the purpose of doing penance. That's how we got penitentiaries, and becoming rehabilitated so that they could return to their families and communities and be reconnected to them. As many of you know, that prison mission changed significantly starting in the late 60s, and much of the change represented a backlash to the achievements of the civil rights movement and was seen as a way to punish and control Black people, not rehabilitate or empower them as was done for whites. The prisons located in our small Adirondack communities became part of a major effort to bring about the oppression, harm, and destruction of Black men, their families, and their communities. These Adirondack prisons became an integral part of what we call the prison industrial complex, and they function in a manner similar to that of plantations during chattel slavery in America. While providing economic and social benefit to whites, they exploited Blacks, destroying many of their lives in the process. Most of my professional life has been spent witnessing, feeling, and dealing with the destructive impact of this new enslavement system visited upon Black people. Here is how it looked and functioned to me and others. It was similar to, in many ways, to chattel slavery during the period I mentioned. For instance, at one point, 70% of all the Blacks living in the Adirondacks area were not free. They were in prison. Many of the employees became white overseers as such, and many of them brutalized the men under their control. And I have loads of stories about that. The imprisoned were robbed of their labor. They did the painting, the caring for cemeteries, the cleaning up, from dangerous environmental catastrophes, and much more for little or no compensation. Then families were torn apart and their members treated inhumanely as they made long, difficult trips to visit their imprisoned loved ones. I remember those buses that left New York City and the pain that followed. Legislators gained political power by counting those in prison as their constituents. Hence, prison communities benefited from federal monetary allowances based on the confinement of Black and brown people in each county. Many Adirondack residents actively worked to deny family members of incarcerated people the right to live near their imprisoned loved ones. Attempts to relocate brought out hostile residents who protested and successfully prevented the relocation of these families in the Adirondacks. Also, we know that many of those who were in prison were subjected to very poor health care and treatment. So in other words, the prisons that are now closed looked like and operated very much like institutions of enslavement. And that's the way we thought of them. As an abolitionist, I am extremely thankful that the state closed the facilities that we are concerned with, because this suggests that legislative and government officials moved us in the direction of reducing the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. And I'm also, pleased and interested in what's going on as a result of the New York State Prison Redevelopment Commission, which was formed and charged with helping some impactful communities address prison redevelopment. However, the commission's stated mission is seriously lacking. It states, and I quote here, New York State is committed to supporting the many communities impacted by prison closure. This includes the local areas surrounding each former facility, understanding that the employees of those prisons are valuable and many times essential members of their communities. It also includes systems impacted people that may have uprooted through the criminal justice system and make up members of the local community. Our recommendations serve these constituents. I wasn't sure who they're talking about at times. Unfortunately, I didn't get any or see any mention of other impacted people and communities, such as those who were in prison, their families, and their communities. So I've been happy to hear the last two speakers, address that. While I too am concerned about those impacted people and communities in the Adirondacks that the commission mentions, I don't believe that we can move forward and forget what happened to those who were confined and harmed in the closed facilities. So as we work to address the conditions of those identified as impacted and find new uses for the closed prisons, we must also be mindful that we may owe something to those who were and are still confined in a system built and operated to exploit and control. Therefore, I would argue, some form of reparations, which people don't like to hear about, is due to those so impacted. How can this be done, you might ask? Well, I offer no concrete proposals. I do wish to raise my concern and offer two examples of reparations given by individuals to those formerly incarcerated and suggest several other ways to provide repayment. These could provide guidance as we go forward to develop recommendations for finding appropriate uses for the closed prisons. Two of the individual reparative approaches that I speak of were adopted and carried out by two people from the Adirondacks. They could conceivably inspire proposals and community recommendations. The first one I want to mention is John Egan. I don't know if any of you remember him, but he was a former resident of Plattsburgh, I think, And we got to know each other because we're both from the North Country when he was in Albany. He was also the former New York State Commissioner of General Services. And in his earlier life, he built prisons. And after recognizing the human impact of his work, he actually apologized for what he had done and committed his later life to training and employing former incarcerated Black and brown men in the state and in other commercial jobs. The other example that I witnessed, a staff member from one of the Adirondack prisons decided to help an incarcerated young man who feared going back to Harlem upon his release. The worker found housing and employment for the young man upon his release, allowing him to remain in the Adirondacks, where he is doing well, now has his own home and working in a job he finds satisfying. So there are things that we can do. Other reparative ideas include perhaps using the savings from closed prisons and or the sale of prisons. I don't know what will happen along that line, but could use it to support some of the needs of families still traveling to the area to visit loved ones and or to support the education of the children of those incarcerated. Because those who are incarcerated, unfortunately, their children often become incarcerated as well. Monies could also be funneled into health and perhaps substance abuse treatment. Perhaps some of the facilities could be transformed into affordable housing. I know they're not located in the best places for that. And formerly incarcerated residents could receive job training and provided employment. I guess there are a lot of things we can come up with. So if Adirondack residents are truly committed to diversity, and that's the big issue up there now, providing affordable housing would promote that mission to some extent. So I guess my message is that we can't talk about just about architectural structures and how they should be used without talking first about the environment, the history, and the impact on all those directly affected. And that does include people who are incarcerated. So I believe that we can help in a number of ways if the will and commitment is there. But again, we cannot forget what we did to those who were damaged in those closed facilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for your presentation and your very, I was in the middle of writing down what you were saying as you concluded, so I lost my train of thought because I wanted to get down exactly what you said. So Terrell Muhammad is not available to join us this evening. I don't think he's been able to join. He had something come up at the last minute, but I wanted to introduce him nonetheless because he was a very important part of this conversation. And I mentioned that Nolan and Martha Swan and Paul and I were the steering committee, and that we had this conversation, I think Martha noted, was begun over, I think, about a year ago. And Terrell Muhammad was part of that initial conversation and has been a part of several of those conversations since. He was at the Correctional Association of New York and is now a senior advocate at the Family Alliance for Justice, an organization whose mission is to support, empower, and mobilize families with incarcerated loved ones and justice-involved individuals so that they can marshal their collective power and catalyze systemic change. And in his email, his group email announcing this job change, he emphasized the importance and the meaning he got in working with families. in his role at the Correctional Association. So while he could not join us this evening, I think it's important to note his contribution to the conversation tonight and to this larger conversation that is happening throughout the North Country. And so now I will introduce Erin Mayer, who is the Adirondack Wilderness Campaign Director at the Adirondack Council. Sorry, I just wanted to say one more thing about Terrell, which is relevant, which is that he was formerly incarcerated at Raybrook. And so he lived in the North Country and lived in the Adirondacks, developed a love for the region through that. And sorry, I didn't have that in my notes, but I wanted to mention that important fact. Erin Mayer is Adirondack Wilderness Campaign Director at the Adirondack Council. Erin joined the council in May 2021. He is an environmental justice pioneer who has worked in the last 40 years in the spaces of health, environment, climate change disparities, and wilderness protection. Erin is an urban environmental activist and a regional and national environmental justice organizer and strategist who has advised 2 presidents, Congress, served on the National Board of Directors of the Sierra Club as its 57th president, and as the New York State Atlantic Chapter Chair. And we're very honored again. This is such an amazing panel, and we are very honored to have Erin here to speak to his perspective, both in his lifelong roles and specifically as in his role at the Adirondack Council.
Thank you. I'll make sure I take myself off mute. It is indeed an honor to be with this august body. In fact, I know most of you through various incarnations of my work, and I really want to lift up the pain, the love for the work and appreciation of the work that Alice Green just in the analysis that she articulated that needs to be lifted there. This is more than a project that is dealing with architecture within geography. A little bit about my professional background, that I retired from the health department as a spatial epidemiologist. Basically, I mapped diseases, things occur within space and place. I also leveraged that expertise, as Alice Green knows, with regards to the Voting Rights Act for 3 decades for the NAACP, 3 federal lawsuits on fighting for reapportionment rights for people of color. And again, when it comes to power, this is all about power. Power and representation is another key piece, and that representation decides what gets economically developed or where things get cited, who wins and who loses. So I use my skill to do, as I say, as much restorative work for communities of color in lifting up their voices and their representation, but to also document the institutional and spatial impacts of decision-making of politicians. And also, as my sister Martha Swan knows, that I'm a massive genealogist for 4 families, and I'm, as a result, a passionate student of 19th and 18th century American history, which leads me to my other side of my deep analysis with regards to impacts on family, land, and space. And all of that is present here. I am the Wilderness Campaign Director for the Adirondack Council. I took this job primarily because we now have less than 4 to 5 years to seriously act on climate, and we need wilderness carbon sinks to, as I say, to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. That area that you see behind me is very critical to that. But within the needs and demand for this place in space is its deep history in the past, this recent early part of the 20th century. It was the most model workforce development entities known to man. We got our Civilian Conservation Corps, which basically was the forerunner to the National Park Service and the workers within the Forest Service. A lot of that pioneering work occurred in the wake of the Great Depression, where then Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt needed to put people to work. And so repairing trails, if you go to Mount Marcy and some of the other places, you'll see WPA signs where workers were trained on building these structures and building trail work. And then that went on to become the Works Progress Administration Civilian Conservation Corps, which to this day, everybody cannot go to a national park without Civilian Conservation Corps infrastructure. And just like everything else in America, even that faced as I say, the realities of America: race, place, and space. Civilian Conservation Corps entities in the South were deeply segregated. Whites going from the work from Conservation Corps to the land as success protection, while Africans, it was the late 60s and 70s that you start to see them within the ranger workforce. And so race has always mattered. And what's also deep about these places in space, and again, Camp Gabriel's, Bloomingdale, New York, Mariah Shock, Ray Brook, all of these institutions of mass incarceration exist within a historic place going back to voting rights, which is again part of my passion and fighting for. They were part of the early 19th century, 1820s through the 1840s efforts to, as I say, gain suffrage for African Americans within the United States. And this was part of the Garrett Smith land scheme. And now people get it twisted and they center on Garrett Smith and John Brown and ignore Willis Hodges and the Blacks from Weeksville, Brooklyn, and Bedford-Stuy, Brooklyn in the early 19th century, who were actually agitating for the right and voting suffrage. If you know anything about Albany, the Stephen Harriet and Stephen Myers home, these entities and these people were the ones who put together that scheme that inspired Garrett Smith to basically pay for the 40 acres and, as they say, and the right to vote in this area. But what's important, these very places and spaces of liberation, whether people lived there or owned the land there, it was the right to vote. And they went from places of liberation and inspiration for the right to vote to now, in the modern sense, the places of mass incarceration, taking away one's freedom and liberty. They become turned upside down on their head. So when we talk about how to rethink and revisit and reuse these places and spaces, this thought process, whether it is ARC or whether it was the Prison Redevelopment Commission, the conversation still needs to be had and centered on Black voices as well. Just letting folks reminisce about the incarceration stripped of all the other very powerful threads of history that this land, if this land could talk, would tell us, we're missing a number of opportunities. I am definitely for preservation and reuse, but that conversation cannot, again, be held from the lens and the view and the control of white interpretations and white commissions, and therefore it is another perpetuation of white perspectives on Black realities. It's stripping away any nutritional value for any current or future African American community. And that's why the point of reparations and restorative justice that Alice Green so eloquently speaks to is a very important part of any conversation now or going forward. It's not just having a place in the memory. We don't want to reinforce the memories that structurally hinge upon the inequality and the politics of inequality and racism that created these institutions. When you can use prison populations, knowing heavily minority, and load it with the values of Rockefeller toward drugs and mainly people of color, and that they then use prison populations as a tool of economic development, several things happen. It's not only just the prisons, but the sociology of the entire community and culture around and the orientation of these communities that surrounded these facilities and places toward people of color. All their myths, phobias, and fears and stereotypes were reinforced through this model of incarceration and economic development. Again, a wealth and structural inequality by which working class and lower class whites would benefit off of the burden and suffering and the institutional inequalities that created that prison population. Remember, poverty drives crime. This is something they've known since the day. If you can't look at any modern movie, was it the Bowery Boys? Everybody knew about the Bowery Boys. But then it was mostly whites engaged in. But the point of the matter is, economic deprivation leads to people, if they don't have access to opportunity, they go to the Black market, and the Black market leads to the crime and the incarcerations. But the legacy right now, what we're dealing with is, what do we do with these places and spaces? Well, again, let's also talk about the current space right now and the current reality. We see the resegregation of America. You see that there is a massive backlash demographically against the increasing power and the elevation of people of color. Not as some scheme to disrobe or displace whites, but it's just the natural demographic growth. It's just science. It's not racism, it's just science. But this is not people coming after white folks, but politicians are using that to create boogeymen. And no place is more emblematic and problematic than that which is, communities within the blue line. One of the things, since I do a lot of electoral analysis and political analysis and reapportionment work, is the power of race replacement theory being articulated by seated Congress members from this region who are playing right into the violent vitriol that gave rise to the ugly incarcerating attitudes of those who oversaw those Blacks who were in prison there. There is still that perspective shaped as a consequence of the prison industrial complex that Alice Green so eloquently framed. It was an industrial complex. So all the stuff that feeds into it, that derives from the economic benefit, and then nobody pays attention to what was the throughput, what was the input, and what was the impact on their families and communities. But more importantly, the political attitudes and the culture that are still coming out of this important region. And so all the more reason why me working in this place and space, working on diversity, equity, and inclusion is not coming from some wishful thinking, but the necessary urgency. We need to really rebuild the psyche and the soul of not only those who were incarcerated and had that stripped away, but even from the whites who were cheated out of this process and out of this culture. So the point of restorative justice and reducing and repairing the harms, the state has a hell of a burden that it must make right. And a prison redevelopment commission that only tokenistically looks at the economic side of closing a facility, but not looking at the culture that they created. Let me be clear. The context of those who now have the MAGA or replacement theory mindset and how they, and again, you just look at the voting patterns and what's pulled up, the flags and all that stands for is articulated by the current governor in Florida, but and our seated Congress people that tell you what they think about Black people. Let's be clear about this, what they feel and think about Black people. And more importantly, in a state in which, depending upon how, they classify the Hispanic population, because there's Hispanic white, non-Hispanic white, but if they look at it, if they count it as Hispanic white, and you're dealing with a state whose population is 70% people of color, 70%. And on a conservative end, 65%. So 65 to 70%. So the current value that was created and the culture that was created and the sociology that was created at the prison industrial complex is unsustainable in a state that is significantly majority minority, but also where the political center of power now is within these communities from Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and the metropolitan area. These leaders now have the opportunity to shape the conversation of culture and can be very powerful voices in restoring that culture. To that end, one of the things that I've done through my work, from the climate work and the environmental work, but also reconnecting and restoring justice in people, culture, and history, was to hold, learning journeys for our elected leaders of color to come to the Adirondacks and learn about the Black suffrage settlements and some of the settlements that had become prison sites, and showing that irony. And more so now than ever, there's a determination within a lot of the young leadership within our elected leaders of color from downstate and across the state to absolutely reconnect and reclaim that history. But I can dare say, just making it a monument to prisons is we want to be very careful in that conversation and how it's shaped. And what it needs to be is anchored in, I think, its original purpose, in these cases, the suffrage settlements, but also the other benefits and economic opportunities where it was the pioneering aspects of giving people jobs, but it led up to the creation of the Civilian Climate Corps. And now we have in the current vernacular and conversations around the Green New Deal and the Green Job Corps, Well, the thing is that we now have, again, this wilderness can rise to meet that occasion. Recently, Mariah Shock has shut down and closed down. Even though I was recently at a press conference calling for the repurposing of it, it was still kind of stressful for me to hear elected leaders saying, well, there was nothing wrong with it before. Why do we have to let it go? Well, the same reason as Allison pointed out, it's labor theft. It's wage theft. If you want prison labor, I always tell people, if you want something and you just make it only white people. If you have prison whites incarcerated like that, you would see it disappear overnight. But folks were comfortable with people of color, blacks and Hispanics primarily, being enslaved. I call it the modern chain gang without the chains. And that's okay, but it has never been okay. It is a shame and it's a blight, because at the end of the day, they know that there's an economic need for what we call the Department of Public Work activities in every community around the country. Communities that have the tax bases can afford departments of public work, but unfortunately, communities within the blue line cannot afford departments of public work. So they relied upon prison labor. And these men were not compensated. Their families were not compensated, whereby wages could actually keep them out of poverty. That was stripped away. The value of what they've done was stripped away. And then as Allison and as Martha heroically fought against, how their families who wanted to be near them were treated, as they said, doubling down on the pain. And then just the attitudes of those who could lord over those who, by virtue of their race, caste, and class, were the main drivers of why they were incarcerated in the first place. And so reversing these things, I think we have an opportunity through how these places are adaptively reused, is a tremendous opportunity. We need right now, they got the Champlain Hudson Power Express coming through. The biggest need for it is workforce development. We now have the need for high volume places to create that workforce to help deal with the clean economy, the green economy. But little investment is going into those places and spaces. We think that the private sector will fund that, but that, we all know historically the private sector has always underfunded that. That is something, again, going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where government steps in and does the heavy lift on workforce development, help thereby creating that human labor and workforce with the living wage and union jobs that now meet the current economic, in this case, the climate crisis. So everything from people manufacturing or putting together and assembling wind turbines, all the way down to those who would be the cable layers and the dredgers of the riverbed as they start to bring the clean energy solution from Hydro-Quebec down to New York City. Again, folks talk about the high value of those jobs, but right now we need the heavy lift of government to step in, as it did, during the Depression with the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, Works Progress Administration. But we have that capacity. You don't need to have somebody, give it to a private entity they have to go through a constitutional amendment hoops. No, we need that portion of the governor and the legislature to get together around the table to create that civil service portfolio of jobs and trainee jobs, and the repurposing and the conversion, like of a Mariah Shock, where you can have limited impact on historic infrastructure. But again, you have the base and the foundation by which you can start to repurpose these places for need that meets the 21st century. But here's the other thing: when you bring in a diversified workforce and training workforce, it starts to break down that culture of superiority and inferiority that has often been perpetuated by prisons and the racism that builds up prisons, and the culture for almost the past 80 years in the North Country that has been, as I say, lifted by an institution that was anchored historically in racism and the loaded coded words of war on drugs or whatever you want to call it. And again, people say, well, wait a minute, well, they were drug addicts or whatever. Let me be clear. Many of us, Allison, myself, and Martha, we grew up in the generation, 60s and 70s, and we saw what heroin did to the Black and brown and Hispanic communities in this country. And they were treated as criminals. Having an addiction, they were criminalized. But when that same opioid crisis hit the white communities, even cops are now ordered to carry Narcan to save their lives. back in the 60s and 70s, they had no problem in watching Black and browns die on the street and or arresting them and having them to go through withdrawal through incarceration. It was a form of torture, in which Rockefeller created an entire complex around, and in which the Adirondacks and entities like it, the prison industrial complex processes, housed and warehoused those populations. And it's 180 degrees different. The only difference is 40 years ago, they would have been whites would have been incarcerated and suffered in jail. Treated for the crisis and been enough to save lives. So right now, the question we talk about restorative justice and reparations, yes, we do owe people. There are countless people who had their lives altered, and they're only guilty of being born at a different point in time of public policy and a different race and who that public policy would benefit or take away from. So for me to come full circle and to bring the advocacy for the planet and the climate, and seeing also still the beauty in restoring the history and connection to the Adirondacks, we also have an opportunity right now in the wake of the multi-billion-dollar bond act. They got the Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to put billions on the top line. Right now, the question really is, how do we help the governor and the legislator get the right people around the table to help get this beautiful infrastructure scaled up to meet the climate challenge, to meet the restorative justice challenge, meet the workforce development challenge. And through that whole new reuse of these geographies and these places and these spaces, we start to do the healing and the cultural healing that I know we can do. Great stuff has come out of the Adirondacks. My sister Alice Green comes from the Adirondacks. She's part of that long history of Black freedom fighters that have come out of the Adirondacks. But right now, we need all of us to be freedom fighters to make these places sing and be of use again, but also, yes, to record and capture that history. But again, it's more than just prisons. It's place, humanity, and space. How do we restore and rebuild that humanity in these places that were once points of liberation, that became places of incarcerations and deprivation, but also who not only injured the soul of people of color, but poisoned the minds and souls of people who were white that thought this was a good idea. We have a lot to do, but this is a powerful opportunity in which to do that. So I'm a pleasure and honor to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your contributions to this conversation this evening. And the important points about what was missed in governmental conversation about reuse of these spaces, and the important points about restoration and reparation and reclamation for the communities and the people who are harmed by the policies of the government that created the places of incarceration. I would like to have a conversation now among not only the panelists, although certainly among the panelists, but also the audience and the people who have joined us this evening. We don't have any questions yet in the Q&A, but if members of our webinar audience have any questions for us, please, now is your chance to write those in the box. Okay, so we have one question.
Actually, two questions there.
What was that?
There are two questions there. One's from a Tracy Corbett and another one from an anonymous attendee.
Yes, yes, thank you. So Tracy Corbett says, thanks so much for this presentation. Very well done. Tracy worked on creating a museum at Sing Sing for years until her recent retirement, and appreciates this evening's presentation. Thank you, Tracy. An anonymous attendee asks a question about how many closed prisons are in the Adirondacks, and at the peak, how many inmates were in prison there, and how many are in prison now. That's not information I have, but does somebody else in this audience, in the panel, have that information, or somebody in the audience?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact number right now, but I know in the late, in the 1990s, we were talking about 72,000 people who are incarcerated in New York State, and that number has decreased considerably, which is fantastic. And now it's more around 40,000 kind.
Good, that's the direction.
Well, I haven't, followed the current stats because again, it's not my immediate area of expertise, but from a reapportionment sense, and it was touched on earlier in the conversation, that these people were not only imprisoned and having their freedom and their wealth stripped away and their families broken down, but the other perverse side of it, that their bodies, for the sake of reapportionment and the political power, they were actually a political power multiplier for white elected officials at statewide Senate and Assembly and congressional who were basically just flamingly racist. Let me be clear about them. So their bodies in numbers for the purpose of reapportionment were used to get them districts that had, remember, the more people you count, in the case of color who had no power and had no ability to vote, then you had a district de facto less that population than any other district. So your district was even less competitive. And so it's a fascinating, perverse piece of use of demographics. And this was one of the sins that has been used around the country, where you can have legislators with half the get of voters because they have a large prison population. So the demographics cut for a number of ways. But the thing is that the conversation needs to be, these solutions relative to incarcerations and the conversations around them need to be handled locally in the counties where they occur. They should not be used and exported for any economic purposes, because at the minute that you get into the economic incentives, you get into a race to the bottom and also a degradation of the human beings and the souls that are there. You're going to say, well, you're justified in treating them this way. No, the answer is that how you're treating them, if it's not related to what their charges are, then you're actually exploiting them, doing harm. You're committing a crime. And for some people, they get caught up in the sanctimonious argument of what people deserve, what have you. But the point being is this. The answer is that the state is moving away, but it needs not move away so quietly and try to sweep this under the rug, which I think is another piece of this. And the restorative aspects and conversation needs to be had. But I think the other piece too, in justice to the communities where these places were being held and this social experiment was being played upon them, I just think that we also have to deal with how these places now become real economic development engines and real places of economic opportunity that are not anchored to race and imprisonment.
Thank you.
No, related to what you're saying, Aaron, I mean, the horrible thing was that you're right, the politicians were able to get into office and with very few actual votes. And so you destroyed the one man, if you want to call it, one man, one person, one vote, whole concept. But the horrible thing about it was these people were put into office to represent the people that couldn't vote. And they were not the least bit interested in representing the population that they got into power through. And that's what's really horrible about this whole thing.
Thank you for reminding us of that point. And I think we can't be reminded of that enough when thinking about the power dynamics and the multiple layers of the power dynamics.
Right, and those are the people who were very supportive of, increasing the prison population. So it fed off of itself, which was absolutely insane.
Yes.
Aaron,
Jeff, yes, did you have a?
I could just say something sort of just about the question about the number of facilities that are closed and the population question. So there are 3 standalone prisons that have closed inside the Adirondack Park. So the facility in Gabriel's, the one in Lion Mountain, and the one in Mariah, and that's all happened in the last 14 years. And then there's the annex at Clinton Correctional Facility, that also inside the park, but that's sort of part of a larger facility. And that closed last year. And a prison that's just on the edge of the park in Chateaugay in Franklin County, that also has closed. So really like 5 sort of right in that area. When I was doing my research, I attempted to, I made an attempt, which was difficult with incomplete records, to try to calculate the number of folks who were incarcerated in the North Country. And by the late 90s, which was, as Alice pointed out, was like the peak of the prison population in New York, I estimated there were roughly 20,000 people incarcerated in the Adirondacks and in its immediate periphery. And that number today, of course, has gone down significantly.
But the Adirondacks is left, in my community, the Adirondacks are seen as prison country. I have people who work with me and, you know, very well versed on many issues. They're scared to go north because they still think about it as prison community. And also they know about the horrible times that families of prisoners had when they tried to visit their loved ones up there. So so there's a lot of work to be done, because when we talk about and work on trying to bring diversity to the area, it's tough for many people, because they haven't changed that, you know, their thoughts about and the beliefs about the Adirondacks.
And that's a very powerful point, Alice, because just recently, the beginning, kicking off of this year in January, you know, right there in Saranac Lake, a child was pretty much chased. A family had to flee to North Country. Again, the persistence of these racist attitudes above and beyond the prison. Again, this created an entire culture where folks feel that it is okay to attack people of color. The past Nikki Hilton Patterson, past Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Director for ANCA, literally had graffiti spray painted on approaches to her home, you know, telling, you know, N-word, go home, or what have you. So the culture that is created in the wake of this has to be addressed. And so it creates a fear of who, place, and whose space it is. And this is one of the reasons why I'm proud to do this work, because the added benefit is, I believe, the Adirondacks, who is for all, you know, in the works of you know, a woman by the name of Dolly Robinson, phenomenal labor rights activist in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was her voice, you know, to the state commission that, you know, led to the saving of this place as Forever Wild, the African-American woman, single parent from out of Brooklyn, New York. And now is the conversation to turn that round. Right now, I'm part of another project with Martha Swan with regards to the use management plan of John Brown's farm. You know, remember, John Brown's farm is one of 12 Black suffrage settlements or Black suffrage areas where people had deeds to the land. And these prisons can all be part of a broader UMP. Why just, you know, if they need to build a visitor center and lifting up those 12 settlements and that whole history of the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s and abolition, you know, again, places like Gabriel's can be that place where they probably don't have to worry about disturbing trees and building a massive visitor center that starts to pull in and recenter this history and connecting the piece. Because John Brown's farm, okay, was part of Timbuktu. And by the way, Timbuktu went from John Brown's farm all the way over to Lake Placid, just to let you know the properties and parcels that were part of the Timbuktu settlement. And so just having that history and connected and talking about a much more robust use management plan, you know, I think is key. I think that other players should be at the table that would allow for more investment by the state in how these places can be reused and reused from a point of it restores history, legacy, and justice to all of New York State. Let me be clear. We brought people of color, the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian caucus, not once, but twice to this area. And I don't call it taking nature back. I call it taking nature black, in the sense that there is this deep history that they're being turned on to. And many of that are here know that they want to reconnect with this legacy and this history. They're not disowning the pain, but they also want to reconnect to that lost history as well. And we have an opportunity with these conversations.
Thank
You're
you.
muted.
We have a, oh, Martha, did you want to say something?
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. This has been extremely important and moving and inspiring to listen to. I just wanted to jump in. I see Dave Gibson's question about the potential and possibility of a visitor center at the John Brown Farm, and asking about could the critical history of Timbuktu also, could a visitor center also become a social justice center where restorative justice conversations are equally paramount? I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I would encourage anyone inclined to put forward such a vision and such an argument to put in writing your comments. I think there's about another month that New York State Parks is going to be accepting comments on, from the public with ideas, suggestions, concerns about what happens at the John Brown Farm. In 2021, really noting that that we were at this place in time on this long continuum of people who'd come well before us to protect and that's the site and the history there, lift up the rich history in the region. We proposed the creation, well, first a name change to the John and Mary Brown Farm, and the creation of a Center for History and Human Rights. So Dave, we're very much on the same page. So please put your thoughts in writing to the park.
Thank you, Martha. I'm going to mark that question as answered. And I wanted to, Pete Nelson has two questions. I'm going to actually skip to his second one first, which is the, so his comment, I'll read it for the audience because I don't think they can see the questions. Pete has taught in North Country prisons for years. He's noted that among the debates, the contentious debates over Adirondack prisons, is the ignorance about what prisons are like, the reality of incarceration, and how overwhelmingly it affects people of color. As the panel has noted, it seems to him to be a hopeful idea that a place like Gabriel's, robustly interpreted, could offer a critical opportunity for education and enlightenment, and perhaps move us a little bit forward towards dealing with the reality and racial oppression of North Country prisons. His question for the panelists is, how do you see a possible path towards such interpretation for Gabriel's? And that kind of piggybacks onto another question, which is similar as to what would, well, it says, what would you, and I'm going to take that to mean the panelists, like to be done with the closed prison sites that's both useful and honors the history of the sites? So I'm going to start with a question about Gabriel's, and I think that the, yeah, so I'll start there. Do you, as panelists, see
I'm trying not to suck oxygen out of the room, so I want to leave perhaps Ara and some of the other people. So this is like a progressive stack, you know. So Alice knows I got to put the screws in just for press thoughts and comments, just to give other people in the room the chance to breathe. So I don't want to call on Ara, but other folks, you work there. You talked about your interactions and your experience. I think that this is one of those things that'd be interesting and curious, my sister, to hear from you.
Yeah, that's what I was waiting for.
Yeah, well, I was looking for a fight, so here it goes. One of my biggest bones of contention with all these fantastic plans for the North Country is what kind of resources can you dredge up out of the community and the surrounding area to attract and retain diversity to enhance the community here? Because For me, I came into this community as an adult. I was already well-weathered and tanned to racist remarks. And I found this place to be actually really, really welcoming for me because I don't actually have a tribal group. I was one Asian in an entire community. And I'll tell you that everyone was very kind to me. However, I know that it's not easy to come in as a person of color. Gender is also working factors against you, especially in a prison. But the problem with it is if we recreate the purpose for Gabriel's and other prisons, what are we going to produce in their surrounding communities to retain this diversity that we want to keep to improve our community? And what do you think is possible? I mean, this is going to be asking more than just government. And the other problem I have with is sending something to the government to get it done. I'll be so long retired and gone by the time it plays itself out. I mean, you know how slow these things are. So what is your suggestion about these problems that I see coming with these plans?
Well, one of the things let me throw back at you, as they say, from a government retiree, former vet, and somebody, whose family intergenerationally fighting for civil rights and labor rights. You learn a very powerful secret. You can never rest on government. Government is a continuous struggle. You can't just even win a right or think you have a right. If you think I'm lying, my sisters who are dealing with the fallout from Roe v. Wade, you can't even assume that it is settled law. And anybody who is an American citizen think that they can sit down and take a rest. They're in for, as they say, another political awakening. And these things, are like, steps in the sand on the beach. You got to constantly keep patrolling that beach to keep that footprint there. So I say that to say this: if you think that you can have a one-off with a government investment, we know that that's a mistake. We know that government always puts its money where it wants it to be. And it's always, when we deal with government, it's always a battle of over powerful interests. And if you think I'm lying, why do rich people want to control government, if not to take their tax dollars? They don't pay taxes, but they want your taxes. The government is the greatest creator of wealth. Government is the greatest source of power. So the issue is a civics piece, and this is perhaps my brother Jefferson can point to, is that, the civic side is an enlightened populace. And one of the blessings of New York is that we have a CUNY and SUNY system. And, how do we engage these institutions of higher learning to really retool our population? New York is the shining city of the hill, on the hill. Let Florida claim the darkness that it wants to claim, but New York can absolutely be the virtuous cycle of education, of training, and power redistribution, power defining, power enabling. And the problem is that it's currently disarticulated. And so certain interests right now benefit and thrive in some of the dislocation. But we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity because of the demographics and changing of the state. When they were taking, people struggling and emigrating and busing them from Texas or Florida, to New York to show New York. New York did not bat an eye or look it sideways. It opens its door. And in fact, workforce development folks within the metropolitan area were trying to work with city government and state government to relax or change labor laws that they can take these immigrants. They live the Emma Lazarus model. And the problem is that we have a lot of politicians right now that are still short-sighted, but hey, they're on the decline. That's the good news. The great news is this powerful, dynamic voices of this young, energetic New York State Assembly and Senate, Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian caucus. They are moving in a progressive voice of inclusion and equity. And we just now have to help facilitate that water and that power to rise to include places like the Adirondacks. We want them to reclaim that power of this natural, regional, wonderful, recreational, but also potential for workforce development. All these things. There's a lot of power to reclaim here. And as my sister Martha Swan knows, if you write a good book and you tell a good story, you'll have always a powerful audience. New Yorkers love a story. I say we love a story more than any William Faulkner. People from the South love a story. And we have that here in the hills, and we have leaders. And so the question is really, how do we rearticulate and connect and build that connective tissue with political leaders, this environment, the people here within the state who really want to engage. So I see, I'm a little bit more of an optimist. I mean, I know that government stumbling creates impatience. All the more reason why we need seminars such as this, so that we are cross-pollinating disparate ideas coming from disparate silos to see the possibilities of what we can do and what we can build as a state. So I actually am kind of bullish. And I just think the question is, how do we bridge these doors and how we leverage these opportunities? You know, and so in that regard, I think that if the governor and them are serious with regards to climate change and all that stuff, we have the institutional capacity and resources in some of these former prisons and these other state hospital sites to retool them. And yes, and how we retool them, you don't need to go in there. We need to learn from urban renewal. We don't have to bulldoze every damn building. We can repurpose them, you know. And again, it is the lack of vision and the short-sightedness that gets us into trouble. I think that the opportunities for us to slowly inhale and engage one another, just the power of having Alice Green, you know, Martha, you, Jefferson, all at this table, and Aaron, the institution of ARC, all of these disparate points showing and giving light an opportunity to the hope of what we can be. So I'm a big believer in government. Why? Because business is a big believer in government. If you think I'm lying, look at how they're trying to take it over using racism, hate, and division, because they want that power. And I think that we need to rise up to take that power back to transform this region.
All right, I wasn't sure what you meant by the diversity, so I missed your question. I'm glad Aaron picked it up, but I was having trouble understanding.
I got it.
Diversity.
I got it.
I have this thing about diversity, so I want to know what I wasn't sure what you meant.
Well, what I meant about diversity in this area, that has been one of the challenges of helping the community that is not normally knows how to engage with people with color. Sometimes representation and diversity in the community itself is the best way to mediate racism, because what most people say to me, and this is normal, they'll say something racist and then say to me, oh, but not you, because I know you. And that's the representation and diversity that I forgive those who say these things to me, because I realize some people don't know any better. And because they've never engaged with people with color, that sometimes the language is flawed and misunderstood. I understand the intention. And I think if we had a better diversity in this community, we would have a community that would, I guess, talk and be more open and maybe retain diverse families as they come to the area. What I wish to see is just more color in the North Country.
Yeah, because when I talk to, I mean, I'm from the Adirondack, and I still live in the Adirondacks in the summertime. And I'm still stuck on what diversity means to most people. I've gone to sessions and with white people, and I asked them, what do you mean by diversity? And usually it's it's something that I'm shocked at, because they talk in terms of having people visit. You know, it's okay to visit the country.
No, and my intention.
We want people to come and ski, and we want people, to boat. Do boating.
Yeah.
And I want to ask them, what happens when you have a person of color living next door to you? Is that what you mean by diversity? They really
absolutely.
And so
that's what we can't retain, is to have someone live in the community versus visiting, because sure, Lake Placid's absolutely diverse for about a weekend. But what about living next door? And I think that removes the stigma when you actually live next to someone that you only seem to visit on television or cable or in the movies or whatever stigma you were brought up to believe. to live amongst people who are representation of all different cultures and all different belief systems
Right.
is key to making a community more palatable for someone who's from a different area to stay.
Right.
And that's the retention of diverse families that we are having struggles with. What is going to be attractive enough to make a family from a diverse background want to stay here?
Well,
Right.
that's an economic argument, right? And that's
Absolutely.
where that workforce development piece and the affordable housing piece, right? Everybody,
Right.
we want more affordable housing, and then they go to APA with a developer who really, again, you know, when you go in with the developer talking about affordable housing, his is a rateable, I want to get the maximum amount. So affordable housing has been used by land developers as a tool to open up and what I call engage in sprawl. It's not necessarily caring about the real needs of affordable housing. So we need to deal with terminology and how it can be used by certain entities for their interests, sounding like it's going to solve a problem in need of the community, but actually there's an economic motive, and really put that economic benefit back in the hands of the community. So if we talk about repurposing some of these places in affordable housing and building in affordable housing complexes within some of these formerly built up areas like prison footprints, then we must actually have, I call, you know, strong government, you know, connection on that, making sure it doesn't pass into private developers, and you end up, you know, with really affluent places that are not going to attract people, poor whites, poor blacks, poor Hispanics, or poor Asians, because they can't afford to live there. Okay, so you have to deal with the economic motive and incentive that really what families build their lives around and relocate around. So there's one issue is housing. And then the other issue is the economic opportunity. Where are the jobs, all right? And so the thing is that if we're dealing with a serious workforce development by putting together that green economy, look, New York State needs tens of thousands of green economy jobs, but we don't have the plants to produce the people for those jobs. We don't have the serious thought and conversation around that. And then looking at the inventory of the footprint in places like the Camp Gabriels or the Moriah Shock that can basically start to, as I say, do an installment or payment. So if you got a workforce development plan and say you got a workforce development starting wage, New York State grade 13 or grade 14, and you got affordable housing at these places, then you start to, instead of populating it with a prison population, you're populating with a unionized workforce development population. And the entire spin-off developments to the local economy of coffee shops and everything, the market that develops around their needs, rather than exclusively the affluent 1% or affluent 10% or 20% of America with recreation and skiing, etc. Not everybody wants to ski, you know, some want to bike, some want to hike. Someone just want to, and listen, the biggest,
Just want to live.
hey, listen, there you go. But the biggest Jones in recreation amongst blacks and Hispanics is fishing. Okay, so there are the markets and things that are there, but the conversation is happening outside of these populations, which, by again, I go back to the demographics. Who are the majority of the population? So the people who need to be in the room. People in the power circles where there's these conversations. This is not to beat upon the governor or the Senate or the Assembly, but they need to really talk about who's in the room and how do we holistically really rebuild and build sustainable communities, because you can do it. We have some baseline places and spaces to do some modeling and pilots. So Gabriel's and Mariah and entities like that have a footprint by which you can start to experiment. You know, we're not talking tens of billions. We may be talking 3 to 4. That's okay. But $3 to $4 billion in investment in workforce development, investment in jobs in the Adirondacks is a $3 billion investment in infusion that I would love to give to the Adirondacks, because it will be producing the thousands of green worker jobs that we can absolutely look forward and see, but also have that immediate impact, but also build that affordable housing impact to support that population. And that is a beautiful, heavy government lift, but I would rather have that lift invested by the government than have that put in somebody else's private sector pocket, who just perpetuates the racism, division, and the hypocrisy that we see.
Because I don't see diversity being becoming real unless you have that. You know, we can talk about it all day, and we can invite people up and all of that, but unless you do some workforce development and people have to have jobs and affordable housing, you're not going to have that diversity that I think some people are talking about. I'm from the little town, and we pulled some people together this summer to talk about diversity. And I had people telling me how diverse the town that I lived in was. And when we started talking, I mean, I was the only Black family there, right? But when you had different ethnic groups, there were a lot of different ethnic groups. They were from everywhere, Poland, France, Spain, all of that. And but when a Black person entered the town, I mean, they all, you know, united against this outsider, you know. So I like to have that discussion about what we mean by diversity in the North Country, especially because I don't think we're there yet.
I don't think we're even close. And one of the hardest parts is even if you do entertain the jobs and the housing, young families need childcare. We have miles and miles and miles of impossible roads to travel. Transportation, how is it going to be feasible for a lower income family to survive in the North Country on entry-level jobs? Because obviously there are not a large pool of high-paying jobs at entry level here. So how is a family going to survive and stay here? And that's a common element that I see. Young families who do try, they want to stay here. They find the school systems to be very appealing, small with small classrooms, but they can't afford to stay. Where are you going to take your children for daycare? How are they going to get to school? How are you going to drive to work if it's 13 miles and the only affordable home you have is in a cabin way out in the woods, because everything in town is either an Airbnb or rented out at high, you know, as everything's rented out. So, you know, I'm talking about a community-wide, it's deeper than just a couple of jobs in government. I think there's a lot of other infrastructure issues that are barring us from getting and retaining these families.
Right. And it's gotten worse since COVID because now these
Mhm.
populations grabbed up by
And one of the things is to do a quick plug for the Adirondack Council. One of the things, because everybody thinks the Adirondack Council only cares about wilderness at the expense of people. One of the things that we did was an impressive report called Vision 2050 that actually deals right in this issue of people, housing, sustainable infrastructure for family, work, sustainable, vibrant communities, equity and diversity. So one of the good things about a diverse workforce, you get deeper intellectual thinking. And you know, and the benefit of working for the council, you know, I got myself, my brother Rocky and Gary, so yeah, you know, two brilliant individuals. I at least think we're brilliant. But the point being is, amongst, you know, not-for-profits in the Adirondacks, probably one of the most diverse, but really people of color in power. And not only that, working with some very powerful women organizers and leaders in conservation chair Jackie Bowen. You got a Vision 2050. It's I think a serious holistic, you know, conversation starter, and I think an anchoring point to begin. But you know, it's that whole, you know, our looking at the whole ecosystem in which we have people and communities and families and the needs holistically. And you know, Aaron, what I'll try to do is make sure I'll get to you the link for in fact, go to our website, the Adirondack Council, and look at the Vision 2050 report. But I will also get to you so that you can actually distribute that to any of the folks who are interested in that deeper question that both our youth raised and Alice Green, you raised as well.
Thank you. I was just pulling it up so I could drop the link to it in the chat because it's a document I'm well familiar with, and it's a very important document about the future of the Adirondacks. And I wanted to, we have some questions here in the chat that are, or in the Q&A. They're all three that are somewhat related. One is an appreciation, Erin and Alice, for your messages. There's a conversation about what will prevent places from becoming seasonal housing and contributing to gentrification. I think that some of that may have been answered in the conversation that was just had about affordable housing, and many affordable housing incentives include some protection for the residents in those housing developments.
Absolutely. There's something called deed restriction, Division of Housing Community Renewal. As a person whose family benefited from affordable housing, in fact, my first house I bought, again, coming right out of graduate school, was built by a gentleman by the name of Charles Toohey. And one of the things that they had within that deed were, you had the number of years you had to live at the residence. You had other depending on how much grants you want, you sign up for more deed restrictions. So government has the power, as they say, with those incentives to provide, you can economically incentivize people. It was a wealth and equity creator for me, because owning that home at the age of 25 was a big deal. The fact that you could come out of SUNY Albany School of Public Administration with an internship job at the state, those things, the grants allowed me to pay for a mortgage with the affordable housing program that Charles Toohey created for thousands of low-income families and families of color in the capital region. So this is not rocket science. It's just basic human science. And so if you think that, you got to worry about gentrification, no, in fact, many of those communities are still, little hamlets still exist to this day. And it is the foundation of wealth that you have for your family. You're owning a home is your first foundation of wealth. And so you can absolutely, with deed restrictions and incentives, the government can structure those mortgages. You can, as I say, with like a Gabriel's, if you build condos or whatever, how you want to, high density condos rather than standalone housing, that lessens the bigger impact of having a bunch of little houses. So you start to talk about density clustering and then the type of class, and then giving the incentives and the mortgage products that can be managed through a local not-for-profit or through, or the government. But the point of the matter is the city of Albany, local government, local not-for-profits and developers teamed up together to build thousands of affordable housing tracts throughout the city of Albany. And this is not just Albany, the Mitchell Lama houses down in the Bronx, etc. A lot of places have rich history in this place and space. And so it's about creating equity and an opportunity. The big constraint is available land mass. Now, what we see with available land mass in the Adirondacks is people try to turn it over to private sector developers who have, again, people got, I'm not going to begrudge somebody to make money, but if you're going to privatize the public good, then you're setting it up to fail. If you're going to use the public good for the public good, then that investment in the people and giving them that head start of equity and owning and living in a place and space where they can live, work, play, and enjoy, it's an already proven successful model. It's just, unfortunately, it's not being applied in the Adirondacks.
Thank you. And I think
Allison, I just do a plug at Allison. Her husband is a genius in affordable housing. So he's probably somebody y'all can have through ARC to do a major affordable housing seminar in the Adirondacks.
and I think
You'll appreciate that plug, Aaron.
and I want to underscore the point that a lot of affordable housing incentives go to developers to create rental housing for people who have are below an income threshold, and workforce housing, but that's rental and that's not building wealth. And I think that the point, reiterating your point, Aaron, that having investments in building equity in property is a very important point there. And I think one that I don't think gets talked about enough, at least in our circle.
Because it comes down to who gets the money, right? Who gets the equity, right? And that's where government is about power. If you want the power and equity invested into the people, we can do that. If you want the power and equity invested in the private sector, that's what the lobbyists do. That's why they, like I said, rich folks, they love political power, they love political pork. And the issue is speaking truth. And if they can scare people away from it, that's the downside. People says, they quote Ronald Reagan, that famous quote, he says, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And the fact of the matter is, we call that the great bamboozle, when you can flip somebody out of a benefit whereby they give it away rather than benefit themselves from it. So that's what one hand does on one side of the political spectrum. But the political science, which Jefferson Hall can speak to, is the art and power of informing the people that they can either empower themselves or make somebody else very wealthy.
Thank you. And I'm aware of the time, and I wanted to some comments that have come through that have been some questions about why Adirondack Architectural Heritage has put on this program this evening. And I talked about it a bit at the beginning, but everything that we've talked about today is about reuse, repurpose, repair, restoration of prison sites in the Adirondacks in the North Country. Everything is connected, and this entire conversation, you can't think about, oh, are you going to put a coffee shop in the chapel at St. Gabriel's without talking about everything else that happened at that site. And that's why we're having this conversation today. We need to make sure that in our role as preserving the architecture and communities of the Adirondacks, as our mission speaks to, that we're talking about all of the communities of the Adirondacks. And so that's why we're here today, speaking to Adirondack Architectural Heritage. And that's why we are so just deeply, deeply honored to have this incredible panel. I think one of you, I think it might have been Aaron, used the word august, and I think that's so true. It is a really, so thank you all for being here today. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat, but we have received some wonderful feedback from the attendees this evening. Thanks to everything you all contributed. So we appreciate your contributions and your time and your energy to be a part of this evening's webinar. To attendees, we will be sending out the link. This is recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. It will go on our website. We will send a link around to everybody who attended tonight and also to everybody who registered for this webinar. So if you know somebody who couldn't attend and you couldn't, or you would like to see the YouTube recording, that will be sent around and it will be posted on our website. And we can also send that link to the Adirondack 2050 vision plan, which actually helped inform a program that we're launching to provide grants to incentivize Main Street developments, small-scale, public-facing businesses in support of our Adirondack hamlets. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you, Aaron and
Thank you.
Alice. Wonderful conversation.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night, all.
Good night. Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Good night.